Quad66. All right, time to wrap things up, wrap this project up. This is this test of 3-inch 1S motors. The motors that I've been testing, and I think these are really the best motors currently available for 3-inch 1S. These are and this motor here is the Hyperlite motor, and I've kind of got these arranged here according to their geometry. So this is the tallest, narrowest motor. It's an 1103.5 motor. And kV-wise, they're reported at 12,000 kV. Middle of the road geometry-wise, this is the Flywoo motor. It's a 1203, and they're reporting this at 11,500 kV. And then the FPVcycle motor. These are the slightly older teal. This is the 13mm motor, but this is the teal rather than the current white ones. I'm not sure how much of a mechanical difference there is, but I understand performance is very similar. But this FPVcycle motor, it's a 13mm, which is and it's actually like a 1302.75 or something along those lines. And they report the kV at 11,250 kV. In terms of other like mechanical differences in these motors, the FPVcycle motor is the notchiest motor. It's always a little hard to show this on camera, but this has got a pretty stiff notch to it, and it's got a nice tick, 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 tick. It feels like a nice notchiness. It's not just like kind of some magnets being further and some being closer. It's just all of them are kind of consistently tight, which gives that nice notchy feel to it. Middle of the road notch-wise is this Flywoo motor. It's kind of I'd consider it like a medium notchiness, where you could feel the notches, but they're not super defined. And you don't get the big clunks. It feels pretty consistent. The least notchy of the motors is the Hyperlite motor. This one's kind of the freest to spin. You feel the least amount of notchiness when you kind of push it along. Some other construction differences on the Hyperlite motor. It's the only one that doesn't have this little metal brace. See how on the base here there's a little metal brace that goes over the top of the wires? And I think that may actually serve a functional purpose with kind of securing the wires, because on these Hyperlites, this is the only motor out of the three that I've had any problems with breaking the wires off at the stator. And on these in particular, what I'd have to do is tape the wires down to the arm in two places. I have to tape up here and also in the middle to kind of secure those wires down. Once I started taping them, no more wire breaks, but it did take me a couple of motors to figure that part out. In terms of weight-wise, these motors are actually pretty similar. The Flywoo is the heaviest motor, and then the Hyperlite and the FPVcycle motor are basically the same. So you can see here the Hyperlite, 4.79 grams. FPVcycle motor, it's probably the lightest here, 4.7 grams. And then the heaviest motor is going to be the Flywoo motor. And the Flywoo, you can see that 5.1 grams. And where that weight comes from, I think generally the Flywoo, I think most of the weight it's carrying in the bell. When we kind of look at the bell, it just seems a little bit beefier, a little bit chunkier. In terms of how these motors have held up, so I talked about the Hyperlite motor had the strand brake, the wire brakes. Otherwise, the bells, I bashed them around and they've all stayed spinning pretty smooth. I haven't had any get bad vibrations on them. Granted, probably maybe a little bit less flight time on these, maybe not, maybe less crashes, but they've held up fine. These aren't like super fragile, happy model motors, and so other than the wire brake, once you tape it down, I think structurally it holds up fine. The FPVcycle motor, I am now down to 3 out of 4 motors that are still smooth. So one of the motors, I think crash damage, just got a little ding somewhere, and now it puts enough vibration that when I'm flying the quad, I can actually see the vibration in the analog feed, which is quite a bit, and you can hear it too. That's not enough to throw off the to put heat in the motors, with the tune, even though I have really low filtering. The motors still stay cool, but it's enough to kind of like ruin the experience a little bit. Now, is that because this is the lightest motor and the bell is the most fragile? It's possible, or is it just bad luck? It could just be bad luck. Every once in a while you hit something just the right way and it kills it. I would expect over time, so all my Flywoo motors are still spinning nice and smooth, and this bell does seem the chunkiest, and so I wouldn't be surprised if that extra weight does give you some durability. Now, obviously, extra weight, you got to carry it around, so you're going to lose some performance, you're going to lose some efficiency and things like that. But at the end of the day, quality of life, how often do you want to change motors and things like that. The Flywoo, if you're looking for a basher, maybe it's going to hold up a little bit better. That's hard to say, but maybe. Last kind of like real objective kind of mechanical structural difference on these motors. So the Hyperlite and the Flywoo are both 1.5 millimeter prop shafts versus the FPVcycle motor obviously is 2 millimeter shaft. In terms of both of these motors, the Hyperlite and the Flywoo with the 1.5 millimeter shaft, it's a pretty loose fit with the props, and so you're going to end up using prop screws. And we'll talk about a little bit more of that. We'll kind of talk about some quality of life things towards the end. All three of these motors, I have flown them both on the GemFan 3018 and the Emax via prop. I really do on all of them across the board. I think the via prop, the Emax via prop is the new gold standard. For a while the GemFan kind of owned the territory because it was the only prop that did what this prop does, this sort of class of prop does, and so it was sort of the gold standard. But now I think the Emax has taken over that spot. Of these motors, if you're going to fly the GemFans, the FPVcycle motor does handle them the best. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. So going through, I flew all of these motors on several different batteries. I've flown them on these GMB 720s, the GMB 600s. These are both high volt, and these are higher C ratings. So the yellow cell, it's a 90C, 180C. The red cell is the highest C rating that you have in these small cells, 100 and 200. And then I've also flown it on these LiPos. These are ones that Rugi kind of liked or brought to market or something, I don't know. But these are LiPos, they're 500, and these are 90 and 180. So C rating supposedly the same as these, and I'll talk more about motors in a bit. Both my quads are built up exactly the same. These are the first generation Tune RC boards. It's a 1S board, FPVcycle board, and they're both built up on the Warpig 120 frame with a 2.5 millimeter thickness. The VTX in there is the Nameless RC. The RX is the Happy Model EP2, and both of them I've got the 199C LDRC camera. And interestingly enough, you can kind of see here, I've even gone and flown, I've done A/B testing on the builds themselves because of some things that I noticed and had to kind of confirm that. So in terms of getting into conclusions of the motors, the one thing I need to hedge here is on efficiency of the motors. The reason I have these built up was because when I was flipping motors around, as I kind of rotated through all of them, I had the initial time that I compared these motors with the FPVcycle motor and the Flywoo, I thought that these motors, I was getting the same flight time out of them. But as I kind of rotated through all the motors on the quads, I ended up switching which motor was on which quad, and then suddenly I saw a difference between the FPVcycle motor and the Flywoo motor. And so as it turns out, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but as it turns out, there's actually an efficiency difference between these two quads, even though they're mechanically, like they're both built by me, they're both on the same exact nightly version of Betaflight, they've got the same Blue Jay ESC firmware, everything that I could get the same is exactly the same, except for the color of the TPU, so I can tell them apart, and I don't think the TPU is going to change the efficiency that much. But at the end of the day, I think efficiency-wise, I do think this Hyperlite is probably the most efficient motor. but it's probably not that much more efficient than the FPVcycle motor. I thought there was a bigger difference initially because of which quad I had these motors on, but looking at things, I don't think that the difference is that huge. At the end of the day, really what I'd want to say is, if you want to know how different the efficiency is, I think you need to just put them on a thrust stand and do the testing objectively that way, because it's close enough to where the difference is in just quality control in the FCs, in the flight controllers, is more than the difference between these two motors, I think. But I do think if you're looking for the most efficiency, I think the Hyperlite is that motor. But very similar. The least efficient is the Flywheel motor. It's not bad, it's good enough, but it's definitely a less efficient motor. And where that comes from, it's a little bit hard to say, but I do get a little bit less flight time on the motors. In terms of what happens on the flight time and what I was seeing between these two quads, so I actually went ahead and did some back-to-back testing, flying the two different quads. So I labeled one of the quads A and one of the quads B. And then I also labeled to make sure, so I even crossed over the batteries to make sure that I was not just flying the same batteries on one quad versus the other. But basically what I was seeing on, and this is both on the Flywoo motor, so this is this test right here, Flywoo versus Flywoo on the same quads. But this will kind of give you a sense of the flight times that I'm seeing. So on the 720 battery, quad A, I'm getting 5 minutes 30 seconds and 5 minutes 21 seconds on the 720 on both the A and the B cell. Versus on quad B, looking at the same cell, 720 got 445 and then 445. So between the two quads, that's like a 35 to 45 second difference. Am I doing the math right? Yes. 30 to 45 second difference in flight time between the two quads on that larger cell. Going down to the 600 milliamp cell, on quad A, I got 4 minutes and 4 minutes 12 seconds. On quad B, I got 3 minutes 30 seconds, 3 minutes 30 seconds. And so that's looking at like a similar kind of 30 to 40 second difference. Interestingly enough, I was able to bring these down at the same exact voltage. So I brought them down when it was flashing. So when I was hovering, I tried to bring it down right when it was at like 3.49 or so, and they recovered out to 3.72, 3.72, 3.73, 3.72. And all 3.72, so you can see that I drained the batteries out very similarly to get those. And so what's kind of nice is I didn't see much difference between like the 720A versus the B battery or the 600A versus the B battery. And I tried to fly pretty consistently where it was a nice mix of stuff, nice mix of punch outs, some kind of low tight in flying, and trying to really replicate what I normally do. And I think with just flying differently and also like what you do at the end of the flight, you can easily shift the flight time by 15, 20 seconds or something like that. But the difference between the quads is actually enough to where it's bigger than those differences. But unfortunately for some things, when we're really trying to get into the details and do A/B testing, I think the difference between the quads, surprisingly enough, is actually bigger than the difference in efficiency between these two motors. The Flywoo motor, though, it's definitely, I think, it really does seem like it's a little bit less efficient. And in terms of how much difference of efficiency, I think it's probably going to be like a 30 to 45 second difference between the Flywoo motor and the FPVcycle motor. Obviously, that's really hard to do and know exactly because I can't put both motors on the two different quads at the same time. And so, conditions change, the temperature outside changes, the wind changes and all these things and get in a different flow. But at the end of the day, I do think it's about probably like a 30 to 40 second difference between the two motors. That's not that big of a deal to me on the 720 because that's kind of the difference between getting, basically 5-ish minutes versus 6-ish, 5:30. Like it's not that much of a difference. It becomes more of a difference to me on the 600, because with the 600 on the Flywoo, on the short end, you're kind of down into that 3-minute, 30-second range. You can actually, if you get aggressive, you can dump this out in 3 minutes, basically. And so the difference in efficiencies makes a bigger difference on this battery. I only have one of these. Let's talk about the batteries for a second. I only have one of these LiPos, and I've been pretty thoroughly underwhelmed by them. Weight-wise, this battery comes in, so the 600 comes in at, can you see that, 14.6 grams. And it's rated as a larger capacity than the 500. And the 500 weighs in at 15.37. So what's that exact difference? So 15 points, so over half a gram difference. With the 600 is actually lighter than the 500. And I get a solid 30 to 40 seconds of extra flight time out of the high volt versus the 500. At this point in time too, I've flown these high volts much more than the LiPo. So one of the things that people kind of talk about is, the high volts, they kind of fade. If you sure, they're great when they're brand new, but then they fade, and then the LiPo is actually better long term. I just haven't found that to be true. This battery has been flown less than the high volts, and the high volts are still maintaining their margin and performance. And it's not just flight time too, especially this is a dramatic difference. When you put the 720 on, the amount of punch you get out of this battery versus the 500, it's a big deal. And granted, some of that capacity in terms of flight time and things like that, I'm bringing these batteries down at the same voltage, and you could argue that, yeah, the LiPo, you can fly it down to a lower voltage, and so I'm giving up some flight time that way. But at the end of the day, it's like, who really wants to fly down at that low voltage when this thing is, at showing 3 volts, 3.1 volts? The flight performance is lame. Like, why do you want to do that? I don't know. I don't get it. In terms of the difference in the weight, I think a lot of that is this big overdone wire. These are some extra thick, extra long wires, and I think a lot of that weight difference is there. You can see where the 600's got the thinner gauge wire, shorter. Could shorten this up too, but that would require extra work. This came this way versus this one, had a PH2 and put that on, and there you go. So at the end of the day, maybe I just got a bad sell. It's possible, but I'm not seeing anything here that's really compelling me to say go ahead and try more of these, because I don't really want to spend 15 bucks and then end up with cells that I don't like flying anyways. Prop-wise, if you are going to fly the GemFan 3018 prop, the motor to do it on is this FPVcycle motor. But overall, all of the motors do better on the AMAX prop. And so we'll kind of put that to the side for a second. So in terms of air, what do I feel? What do I see in the air? What I see and feel in the air, what I hear in the air, is that the Hyperlite motor, it's definitely the stealth motor of the bunch. It's the quietest. But where this motor kind of lets me down is when I'm trying to fly at lower throttle, it just kind of, the bottom sort of falls out of it. It struggles, like when you're trying to fly, so when you're trying to do like the kind of tight in stuff, so you're trying to navigate around tight corners, kind of slower, in terms of how easy it is to keep the quad at a fixed height, there's a lot of throttle management there. And when the motor is kind of outside its torque curve, when it falls below its torque curve, what I notice, what I'm looking for is, can I just put the stick in one place and the quad's going to kind of lock in and not drift up and down? Motors that kind of fall outside their torque range, their power band, what I find is that when you try and find that, you're sort of hunting around. Like you kind of go up a little bit, oh, it's too much, and then, so you go down, it's too much. And it's that sort of full in the shower kind of syndrome where you can't quite lock in. And that's where I find the Hyperlite motor struggles a little bit is lower throttle, and you're trying to kind of like manage the attitude of the quad kind of in tighter spaces. Now, once things open up, this motor's totally fine. I think once you get this motor spinning, I don't see it giving up much to the other motors. Like once you get them spinning up. In terms of so where this motor comes into play is I think it's probably the most efficient. It's definitely the stealth motor. And if you're in more open spaces, it's definitely a very viable option. Now, if you are flying in a space like I am in my backyard, then you really want to consider one of these two motors. Overall, I think it comes down a little bit to quality of life and how big of a difference kind of flight time is to you. Both of these motors are very, very flyable at low throttles. I think there is a slight edge to the FPVcycle motor. When this is down in the lowest part of the throttle range, this motor does feel the most locked in. It just feels like that throttle is the most controlled down at that low range. The Flywoo motor, totally flyable though. If you're not comparing these back to back, I think you're totally happy flying this motor at that lower throttle range. Where you might want to go with the Flywoo motor is I think it does have a little bit more top end. When you're really trying to punch out and throw it, the FPVcycle motor just kind of runs out of the legs, or it just feels a little, to me, it feels like a little restricted maybe. And so I think that is an advantage of the Flywoo, but it's not a big one. It's not a big one at all. And I think with either of these motors, you'd be totally happy. So it's like if you want a little bit more punch, but willing to give up a tiny bit. So top end, if you want just a tiny bit more top end, but you're willing to give up a little bit of efficiency, the Flywoo motor is probably a better choice versus the FPVcycle motor. You're going to get a little bit more efficiency, and probably down low, the FPVcycle motor is the most locked in. And I think also if you are a beginner or developing your skills, or newer to kind of try and fly this like close proximity, the FPVcycle motor is a little bit easier to fly. That's sort of a hard statement to make because that starts to get like, okay, what's sort of like objective versus subjective? There's a really good comment on this flight testing. One of the things is that there's a ton of muscle memory involved in testing motors. And so like whatever motor you're most used to is going to feel good because you got the muscle memory to where you feel like you can hit your marks. And so one of the things that I've done with these motors is I'm not used to any one of these motors because of how much I've been swapping them out, and I've been flying them back to back to back. And so essentially, until I put the Flywoo on both of these quads, I haven't been flying any one of these motors more than the other. And so they're basically, to some degree, they're all new or familiar to me to the same sort of extent. So it helps take some of that muscle memory out of it to where it's like I haven't gotten comfortable with one motor more than the other. And I think at the end of the day, all of them, with to some degree the exception of the Hyperlite, all of them I think I would get very comfortable through the full range of throttle. The Hyperlite, it is I think a little bit more challenging to fly low and slow, kind of tight in the proximity. But at the end of the day, I think you could still do it. It's just maybe a tiny bit harder. So then maybe there's a little bit of durability advantage to the Flywoo motor. I don't know. We'll see how that pans out over time. Advantage to the Hyperlite, if you're trying to impress people with your scale, then the Hyperlite is the lightest motor, and so it's just easier to build up slightly lighter because of the Hyperlite. Sorry, FPVcycle motor is just the lightest, so it's the easiest to build up a quad just slightly lighter than the others. Now, in terms of quality of life between these two motors, the big thing is the props. So we've got to deal with prop screws or drilling or something, because I really do think that the via prop is the superior prop. And so with the Flywoo motor, you're dealing with prop screws, and with that FPVcycle motor, you're dealing with drilling things out. So what do you just sort of pick your poison. What I did is, so in this little, the file for this little jig is available on my Ko-fi site, however you pronounce it. But basically, so how much of a pain in the butt is it? So you put your nylon screw through, and then it sits flush, and you can just take some snips and you snip it flat, and then this screw now is going to be perfect length. And so that's not really a huge amount of hassle. It is a Phillips, at least the ones I use are a Phillips head. I don't know if you can see that. But so that does introduce one different tool that I have to have around. And that's not too bad, other than if they wouldn't tie. So this is the problem with the nylon screws, is you cannot, and this is the less bad way to break it. When you break the top of it off, it's easier to get out. But it is kind of a pain, because I think the nylon screws are actually in some ways a little bit more fragile than the props, and so it's not just that you have to cut the screw once. You might have to cut the screw more than once for any given prop. I think in that regard, I maybe kind of give the edge a little bit to the FPVcycle in terms of the hassle, but it's not perfect. So I did get their tool, and I think it does a good job drilling straight, because I had good results initially, but then once I developed the vibration, I started to panic and think, am I just drilling things out crooked? It's a bit of a chore to use this jig. So you kind of put it together where this is a little guide, and then you go ahead and slide your prop onto the guide. Then, although the point of this, the 2mm thing, is to get rid of prop screws, you're dealing with prop screws right here. So then you got to screw that down, you screw it in nice and tight, and then you can pull out this little guide, and then you go in from this side and you drill through. One of the issues I've been having, though, is that the fitment of this bearing, there's two of them in there, but this one is kind of loose and it's been popping out, and it specifically backs out. So as I'm drilling through, the plastic comes back up in the flutes of the drill, and that actually is enough to actually push that bearing out. So basically what happens after I drill it, I got to deal with it and kind of push it back in. Now I can probably put just a little dab of something, a little Loctite or something around the edge to kind of prevent that from happening. But at the end of the day, I think and by the way, once these are drilled out, the fit has been really good on these. Like, they fit, and it's the right tightness. It doesn't come off, and it pushes on without having to push on too hard. It's basically just right. And so I think overall, I kind of maybe like that. I think I'm willing to deal with that more than the prop screws. So that's kind of like one additional thing I think in favor of the FPVcycle motor, is I think I'd rather deal with drilling things out, because once the prop is drilled out, it's done. You don't have to worry about breaking screws. Now granted, with the prop screws, the ones you don't kill, you can reuse them on other motors. So that, there's that. But it is a bit of a pick your poison kind of thing, and I don't think you can fly 3018 especially on the FPVcycle motor. It's got enough torque down low that it sort of hides some of the deficiency of this prop. This prop kind of has this problem of needing to spool up, but honestly, it basically just kind of doles the tune down on this motor without adding really anything on the top end. And so, I guess at the end of the day, if you're okay having good enough, you can just, the easiest quality of life is just go with the 2mm shaft, get the gem fan motors with the 2mm thing, and then you can just always press them on and you're good to go. I would recommend, so when you press these on to get them off, I would definitely recommend cutting them off. Do not twist them off, because on prior motors I have had the shaft spin inside the bell with kind of wrenching on it too much. So I think I think that's the end of the day. This is kind of how I would rank the motors of this Hyperlite motor. Is interesting, and it's got its niche use. I think for most people are going to be happier either with the Flywoo motor or the FPVcycle motor. If you want a little bit more efficiency, go with the FPVcycle motor. If you want a little bit more durability, go with the Flywoo. A little more top end, go with the Flywoo. A little bit crisper, locked in feel at the low end, go with the FPVcycle motor. And batteries, especially with the Flywoo motor. The Flywoo motor, like these batteries, they really kind of shine. You get that extra punch. These can deliver enough to where it really opens up these motors. FPVcycle motor, I enjoy flying them both on the 600 and the 720. They do well on both, but they don't seem to pull as much amps to where you just don't really need the 720 with that FPVcycle motor. I don't know. Seems interesting that it's such a small difference, yet that's what I feel in air. So that's kind of how I would recommend it of doing that, or 720 in either case. I think that really wraps up kind of everything I had on these. At the end of the day, I really do kind of want to, so I've got so many of these Flywoo motors. You can see I've got 2 sets plus an extra. I kind of do want to get the white ones of these FPVcycle motor, but I'm not sure. I think I'm probably going to fly the Flywoos for a while longer, and maybe grab a set of FPV cycle motors down the road. I guess last thing I think about is how long is the motor going to be around? The Flywoo motors are new, and so Flywoo tends to keep their motors around for a while, so I'm fairly confident this motor is going to be around for a while. The FPVcycle motor, here we are they're on the 3rd version with their white ones. The original ones were the 12 at 2.5, then we went up to 13 millimeter teal, and now it's 13 millimeter white. So we'll see if Ruby sticks with the same manufacturer or bounces around more. And I think that is an issue, so that like with the teals now, I've got 3 teals that are good and 1 that's bad, and what do? I'm kind of stuck with 3 mismatched motors. If I throw a white one on there, they're probably close enough, it's probably fine, but it's not like, it's just going to look, I don't know, look a little odd, maybe drive me a little bit crazy to have 3 teal and 1 white motor. Maybe I'll get 2 whites, and so then I could have like white on the front, or white in the back and teal in front, I don't know, something like that. But anyways, that's the best information that I can get for you and recommendations I can make on these 1S 3-inch motors. Until next time, cheers.